As I mentioned in a previous video where we were talking about the gacha systems within live service games nowadays, whenever I look over at the English side of social media, one thing I notice is that people really like to compare the things that they like with each other, be it anime, games, or maybe even just how good they are at opening cans with their teeth. However, when it comes to live service games, one thing I notice is that people really do like to bring up numbers when talking about the reason why their thing is better than someone else's thing, be it sales or something that the game has done, an achievement that it has achieved, and how all of that therefore proves that their thing is the superior thing. And while a big number, especially when it comes to stuff like sales, is in a way a good sign that the game is selling really well, this does not actually imply that the game is always therefore in a healthy state and will therefore continue to be a good thing going forward. And the inverse can also be true, that while a game may not necessarily sell the best because of the way that the developers operate or the way the content is produced, it can actually end up being a much healthier or at least a more pleasant system for the players who enjoy the game as well. And therefore, in spite of the fact that it may not do as well in terms of the sales numbers, it might actually be in a healthier position than a game that might seem to be a lot bigger. And so, I figured that maybe that would be an interesting video this time around, where we will go through some of the metrics that people do use to compare games, whether or not those metrics are actually all that good, their flaws, their pros and cons, and how you could supplement them with other figures to get a more comprehensive and well-rounded number, as well as some of the metrics that are used within the industry, like for example the developers themselves actually use to decide if their game is actually in a state that is considerably healthy, and some of the other things that they do also focus on in order to ensure that their game is progressing and developing as well planned. Because if there's one thing that they don't teach you in school, it's the fact that the mathematics that you use is actually going to be a lot more useful than you might think, both in terms of game development as well as in actually analyzing games. I feel like if they actually told people that in schools when they were younger, it probably would have driven more people to actually focus during lessons instead of eating pencil lead like I did. But it feels like for the most part schools just are too busy focusing on trying to teach you why you need to run faster than your bullies, but let's put that aside for now. But before we go deeper into talking about all of that, we first need to talk about what it means for a game to be in a healthy state, because I feel like that's one of those things that, depending on who you ask, it doesn't matter whether they're inside or outside of the industry, whether they work on games or just play games, many different people would have a very different perspective on what it actually means. For example, there are many people I know within the industry who would actually say that if a mobile game, for example, manages to exist and survive for more than 6 years in this day and age, especially for a simpler title, then it's already a game that has done pretty well. So the fact that it actually survived even further beyond that, most of that is already like considerable healthy enough. But obviously when it comes to the players, the perception can be very different, where the environment within which the game or its meta might be existing in is more of what they would consider when they're talking about something being healthy. Like when you talk about like a card game, for example, whether or not the game is something that people can play and enjoy without having to always focus solely on a small number of meta decks, all of that plays into the healthiness of the environment of the game itself. But when I talk about healthy in the specific context of this video, I'm talking about a game that is still showing some level of consistent numbers across a set of key indicators over an extended period of time. Because when it comes to mobile games in particular, or I guess most live service games, what you would tend to see is that there tends to be a very big spike at the start when the game first releases, because everybody's excited that the shiny new thing has actually released. And then be it a MMO or a mobile game, people realize that there's a lot to grind, and over time people slowly just start to fall out and play something else instead, because there's just so many games out there nowadays. And so part of ensuring that a game is healthy, be it a mobile game, an MMO, or even a card game, for example, a lot of that comes with ensuring that the player base is actually being kept at a consistent level, or hopefully at a slightly growing pace instead. So a game that hopefully either manages to rise up, maintain, or at the very least reduce the decline to something that is fairly low. For example, in the case of a mobile game, like back in the day when I used to work in something like Puzzles and Dragons, for example, something that would be considered healthy would be in a lull period where there's literally a month where nothing happens, for your total active users to only fall by 5% compared to the previous month. That is already considered an achievement, because that means that in spite of the fact that things are slow and peaceful, not that many people are dropping the game out of boredom. But with that out of the way, let's first talk about all of the different things that people usually tend to look at when they are comparing whether or not a game is successful. And the most common figure that most people use is obviously sales numbers. The reason for this is because of the fact that there are many sites out there that do provide these numbers to some extent with some level of estimation and accuracy differences. But for the most part, you can find many sources and cross-reference them to try and get a fairly decent idea of how the game is performing. And it's a number that is fairly straightforward because big number equal good, because that means more money that they could technically reinvest into the game and therefore make it even gooder and better. However, this is also a value that on its own is actually fairly limited in how much it can explain about the current state of the game, because just because the game sells very well now doesn't mean that it's gonna do much better in the future. After all, when you look at something like even like Magic the Gathering, when Final Fantasy came out, that set essentially broke the record for the highest sales that the game has ever seen. Really big numbers, but it doesn't mean that every other set after is gonna sell really well. In fact, some of the sets that have come after have also fared very poorly. And there's also the fact, especially when it comes to games that use a more gacha-based system, that's a game selling really well in the here and now. It could mean many different potential things. It could mean that the game just simply released something that people really wanted and is really good and therefore more people are spending. Or it could be actually releasing something that is very necessary for the game to go on, and as a result, while the people who spend a lot of money to begin with are spending more to get the thing, other people may be leaving the game, and that will actually cause the game to do worse in the long term instead. And because of the fatigue that it causes, it may also cause some of the bigger spenders to therefore not spend in the periods after, or even worse, it might make the game so inhibitive for new players that you stop getting new players coming in as well. And we'll talk a bit more about those metrics for judging all of that a little bit later in this video. And that's because we'll be moving on to another thing that people sometimes use to actually compare whether or not their game is doing well, and that is the store page rankings. So, it doesn't matter which phone type or brand you use. Most of the live service games that do tend to use a gacha as a main form of its monetization, they tend to be on both mobile platforms, and they also tend to be on PC nowadays as well with all the modern titles. So they tend to exist on platforms where there is already a centralized store page where they are actually able to be lined up with other games and therefore ranked according to the sales that they achieve. And on mobile platforms like the iTunes as well as the Google Store, this is all the more something that is easy to see and compare. And needless to say, if a game is constantly near the top or like the top 50 or achieving first in sales on specific days, this is something that obviously the player base, many of them actually feel as a good sign that the game is doing well, and sometimes will bring that up when comparing whether or not their game is doing well. And I'm not here to deny the fact that this is a sign of some level of popularity. After all, for a game to hit the first place in the first place, it needs to at least have some level of popularity to begin with. A game that is usually not performing well at all, even if it hits a sudden spike, it doesn't necessarily, like even during its anniversary for example, have the power to actually push itself to first place. Usually it's a game that tends to be already some level of popular, and all it needs is something specific to push it up to that first place spot for a specific period of time. But therein lies the problem, which is the fact that hitting first place for a specific period of time, like let's say a day or 2 days in the entire year, is not too difficult if your game already has some level of scale. If your game is already fairly big and has some level of popularity, even if it's not the most popular thing, if it just happens to line up such that when it releases its big thing that it knows is going to sell well, and there's no other competition on the day, getting to the first place spot, even for a game within like out of the top 100 apps on the chart, can be achieved depending on how well the event itself performs. This is something that is kind of possible to manipulate to some extent. It's a little bit like with some of the live streams that some of the games do, where they have this celebration thing where they're like, oh, we got to first place in trending on like Twitter or something, holy shit, and then they give you like a free stuff as celebration. Getting to the first place in trending as well, it's just one of those things where, because of the fact that this is a coordinated effort by a game that at least has some level of popularity to hype up a very specific thing or a very specific hashtag, unless there's something else that's much bigger going on that day at that very moment, it's not that hard for them to just push something just to the top of the algorithm for a short period of time. Frankly, unless there's like a K-pop band performing on the same day, you probably have a fairly good shot of actually achieving, if not international trending, then at the very least national trending trending, especially in Japan, for example. Which is to say that if you ever decide to run a mobile game campaign in the future and you want to make sure our game gets to the top of trending, make sure to check when BTS is having their lives as well. Another thing that people sometimes bring up that I do see is also the amount of fan art and fan content that is being made for a series. Especially nowadays, I feel like when I look at what the discourse that happens on social media in the West in particular is, there's a lot of discussion of things like fandom, and I still don't know what that word fully means because like it feels like everybody has a different interpretation of what it means, so But either way, there are a lot of people who like to look at the amount of fan content being produced. You know, where people sometimes go like, see, my thing on the Susie Becker website is more content than your thing, so therefore it's better. Or something like that. And similar to the store page ranking, there is some level of truth to this in that to get fairly high up in the amount of like fan content produced, you kind of need, you know, a lot of fans in the first place. So to some extent, it is true that it has some level of popularity, and therefore that's why it gets to that point. However, there is also a lot of noise within this kind of comparison because of the fact that while things may exist within the same space depending on how you look at the games, the amount of fan art that is actually produced can vary a lot depending on the demographic as well as the region that something is popular in. Just to give you a slightly extreme example, in this year of our Lord and Emperor, in the year Reiwa 8, Candy Crush is actually still outperforming, or I guess as the kids would put it, it's still mogging Genshin Impact in terms of sales. So for those of you who are wondering, yes, it actually just still continues to perform numbers that are actually like multitudes higher than Genshin, which is actually pretty wild, at least on mobile systems. If you include PC, maybe it changes, I don't know by how much. But here's the question that is more important. Which do you think has more fan art? Do you think there are people out there drawing the donut candy from Candy Crush in sexy lingerie? You know, there's a part of me that worries that there actually might be people who do that. Hey, I don't judge. If you do, cool on you. But for the most part, what we do see is that there tends to be a lot less fan art for it. Now, if you think that that comparison is kind of unfair because like a bunch of boomers played the game instead, the thing is that even when you talk about live service games, right, different games do target a somewhat different demographic. And some games that while they may have a anime-ish aesthetic, while they may seem to target the same otaku crowd, the otaku crowd in and of itself is fractured into many different sub-segments of people that actually like different things, and the level of involvement that they have with making fan content can also vary. And even within that, not all games target this group either. There are some that do target a slightly more casual audience, and so it's very hard to say that just because there's a lot of fan content for this series or that series has less fan content, therefore the game doesn't do as well either. Because even in the live service space, there is a fairly big difference between the types of people who enjoy games such as League of Legends, God rest your soul, Path of Exiles, an MMO like Closers, for example, Genshin, or maybe even Nikke, for example. Some games, because of the fact that they just simply target a crowd that has always had stronger ties to all of this like fan creation culture, especially with doujin culture of people who believe that if the thing I like doesn't exist, then I'm just gonna make it, and then they just go about making like, I don't know, like Dragon Dildos or something. Fact of the matter is that different games target different groups, and therefore this as a metric in and of itself, I would say, can be pretty flawed even if you're looking at fairly big titles in what may seem initially like the same space. All of these methods, while they do kind of work, they all don't really work well on their own, and even if you were to combine all of them together, they still don't really paint a very full picture of everything that you need to understand in order to tell if a game is in a healthy state. Because in the end, using this as a baseline of comparison with something else to say that therefore this is higher, therefore it's in a better or healthier state, may not especially be true. Instead, there are actually better metrics that we can use alongside some of these in order to get a better grasp of whether or not a game is actually in a healthy state and performing well. But that's it. When it comes to the type of data that one would want to use when analyzing whether a company or a game is doing well or not, I would split it into two different types. Basically, the types of data that are more fairly accessible for the average person, and data that is really only accessible to the companies themselves. What the hell happened back here? Oh, okay, look. Basically what happened is that air conditioner actually needs to be repaired and replaced, so I kind of had to move everything out of the way for now. I kind of got the day wrong, so it was supposed to happen tomorrow, but I thought it was the day, so I kind of got rid of everything and I can't like film now without everything being missing. So look, I've put a little friend there, so at least you guys have someone to look at while the entire area here is empty for now. Don't worry, everything will be back soon enough. But when it comes to the type of data that is more accessible, I would say that there is only one real piece of data that is easy to obtain, and even then with that specific type of data, the levels to which one would be able to obtain the data really depends on how much one is willing to actually pay or look into it as well. And the metric I'm talking about is the daily or monthly active users of a game. I've spoken about this in a previous video or two as well, but this is basically the number of unique users that are accessing the game every day and or every month, depending on which data you're using. The reason why I'm talking about both of these separately is because looking at both of these pieces of data are very important, because the monthly active users actually shows you how many people are actually logging into the game within the month, and that is still important in judging the overall health of the game, because not everybody may be hardcore enough to log in every day, but at the very least once a week, maybe twice, thrice. This is all data that will be logged into the monthly active users instead. Whereas with the daily active users, you kind of get a good trend, especially for a live service game, where you expect that when something new releases on day one, there's a huge spike in players, and then it might slowly taper down from there, to be able to look at all of the daily numbers as well to see if it's actually going according to plan. And the usage of both of these pieces of data together basically allows you to see how much of your player base is highly active in the game. Basically, if you were to compare the daily as well as the monthly, the daily should never exceed the monthly, because everybody who logs in and is a unique user within the day is also going to be logged within the monthly active users. So the closer the two numbers get to each other, the more it means that the majority of your player base are more or less logging in every day. This can be both a good or a bad thing depending on what your goal is at the time. If the monthly and daily active users are not rising while these numbers are close, it means that your current player base is hanging around but new players aren't really entering the game, which depending on what your goals are at the present time. For example, if the goal of the game is to pull in new players, then it may not be necessarily a good thing that you have a hardcore player base alone, and that your new events and campaigns aren't actually pulling in the new players that you're hoping they would have. And the reason why I'm saying that this data is all very important to be used with the sales revenue numbers as well is because looking at sales numbers alone can give you a very good indicator of the short term, but the trends of the DAU, MAU in the mid to long term can give you a better sense of how well a game is actually performing over time and how it's likely to perform in the future, because typically a fall in these active users will tend to lead a fall in sales in the future. And there was actually an example of something like this that I actually had to go through myself back in Koei Tecmo with one of their older gacha games. Basically, the issue that game faced was that the director was actually a lot more focused on trying to increase the revenue and the short-term profitability of the game than the sustainability of the game, which I guess in that specific era it came as no surprise, since there was a lot of very small scale browser gacha slop that used to be coming out. And so within that, the idea of like we make something quick, it's fine if it doesn't do well, was something that especially among the people at the top making the corporate decisions was something that they tended to see as being more fine to do. And as a result, in spite of the fact that most of the team was very against it, she actually opted to push basically the equivalent of releasing a new rarity in a game. You can imagine that in a game where 5-star, for example, is the highest rarity, the goal was to release a 6-star rarity, but instead of doing something like what Princess Connect did, where you would evolve the 5-star into the 6-star, they plan to just release a new rarity and invalidate all characters of the older rarity, which is still something you see in games like the meme gacha game, the Gundam one, where you have the ZS like damage numbers that are going into like units of measurement that I don't even understand. That also does the same thing. Needless to say, after all of these decades of these games being around, we do have a sense that doing this is basically as good as almost killing off the game. And for the case of the game that we were specifically working on, what basically happened was that event saw a massive spike in sales. Like, it was the highest the game had ever seen at the time, and the game had been running for for around 7 years. Like, it looks like the game is doing super well. But the only reason why it achieved those numbers is because the new rarity basically put FOMO in the more hardcore user base to then try to max out the characters during that specific event, because maxing out the character would give such a tremendous advantage that in terms of wanting to be at the top of the ranking charts, it made sense for them to therefore spend more money than they averagely would. But this then led to the next issue that the game would suffer from, which was that very same event, the moment it ended, the player base dropped by 30%. That is to say, on average, the regular day without something going on, like a big event like the release of these characters, the average player base saw itself going, spiking at the event, and then dropping below 30% of what was the prior average. So as you can imagine, as a massive drop. In a game where, let's say, you had 1 million players, this means that 300,000 players just permanently stopped the game because of this event alone. And the thing is that after this as well, the game started to see a more rapid decline than it had ever seen prior to this event as well. And in spite of the fact that it was rapidly declining, every subsequent event, every single PvP one in particular, tended to still see sales that used to match the pre-new rarity release. And this will actually go on for a while. And the reason for that is still the same. It's the FOMO of the new rarity, which was also simultaneously causing the player base, especially those who don't spend as much, to dwindle down. So while the game looked like it was doing really well because of the fact that you saw a spike in sales and then it continued to maintain after that, the player base was depleting so quickly that within a year this just became no longer sustainable at all. And so while a huge spike in sales, or a year of good sales in fact, may look like something very good, you need to pair it with something like the average daily users or monthly users as well, in order to ensure that what you're looking at is just not a short-term increase that might actually result in future damage to the game, or that is already resulting in that future damage because of the fact that the way that the game is being run while it's still earning the same amount or more money is just more fatiguing for players who would rather find something else to play instead. The other type of data, and this one is a lot less numerical specifically in a way, would be to look at the close competitors of the game and see how the game is performing compared to them. This is actually a lot harder than one might think, and this is actually a more businessy thing. Basically, what you're trying to do is to find good close competitors of the game, and basically using the trends of how those games are performing to try and understand better how the game you enjoy is also performing compared to the industry average. The reason why I say it might be harder than one thinks is because, well, it might be easy to just try to simplify all of this and say that, like, oh, but all gacha games, they're kind of the same. They all have like barely any gameplay. They all just focus on the story and music. The fact of the matter is that the gameplay does matter to some extent. On top of that, there's also how all of the macro game resources are managed, as well as how the story, as well as the music and all of that, how all of it is designed as well. Because someone who enjoys the story of something like Genshin may not necessarily enjoy the story of something like Nikke as well in the same way, because they do go in fairly different directions. One is like a fantasy open world thing, and the fact that we're even using the word open world kind of implies that the game actually has a form of gameplay and system that makes it different from something else that is more of a shooter where you just kind of just aim it directly on the spot and fire, a bit like in Time Crisis or something. And it also implies that one of these games may not necessarily be as much of a substitute for the other than one might think. And the reason why this is difficult to gauge is because then one would actually need to analyze all of the different systems, themes, and everything within a game to try and actually properly understand how similar are these to the things that you're trying to compare it to, which is typically the kind of thing you would see in a more businessy side, actual product analysis or something. There are actually a fair number of tools, basically the big data analytics firms that do exist, that many of the game companies, especially the AAAs, like even a company like Larian Studio, which made Baldur's Gate, for example, does use some of these. All of these companies do provide data on how games, both within the full price consumer title game as well as the live service side of games, are actually performing. With the close competitors as well, many of these tools actually do have the specific feature comparisons as well, so you can actually line up multiple games and it will actually give you a list up of all of the different features within the game, the themes and all of that, and how much of it actually matches. And on top of that, some of them also do basically show like game title overlap, so like how much of the percentage of a player base of a specific game also play the other game and stuff like that. So you can kind of actually use all of this to kind of see how much of your game overlaps and is actually close to some of the competitors that one might actually think. And using data like that alone would then give you a good basis from which to then figure out who the close competitors are, and then figure out if, let's say, if you see a 30% drop in your DAU and your MAU, is that actually a result of specific decisions that the company took that made the players pissed off and decide to leave? Or is it just something that's happening to the entire industry, maybe because like the entirety of America suffered a blackout or something, for example? But that's it. When it comes to the tools that are easily accessible, at least, it's mostly just the two of these things, and these are the base level tools that many companies as well as the people within them actually use to try and either propose a new game title to the execs in the company, basically to try and like provide data to try and justify why they should actually fund this game, or to basically make a decision on whether or not a certain feature should be added to the game, or if the game needs to take more drastic action, or if it needs to actually reinvest even more into specific things to try and retain the players because of the fact that the game is actually underperforming compared to others within the same industry. And the reason why the rest of the data that we're going to be talking about is not as accessible is simply due to the fact that most of it is just something that only the company themselves can truly have a proper grasp of the number to be able to actually make an informed decision about whether or not something is an issue. You know, I have to say that like having all of this open space is actually messing with me quite a fair bit. I don't think I've seen my room this empty for a while, and it's making me feel like conversely very unsettled. You know, like I'm having the inverse of claustrophobia right now, where I'm seeing all the open space and I'm feeling uneasy instead. But that's besides the point. More importantly, let's talk about the data that is harder to access. And the first big example that I want to talk about is something that I would call the demographic user attrition. And what this means is the attrition, or the rate at which the players in each of the individual demographics of the game are actually leaving the game. So the thing with most of these, especially live service titles, is that contrary to what some people might think, they actually have access to a lot of your data the moment you click that accept button and you actually enter the game. More often than not, most of these games are actually tracking everything, especially the mobile games. Like when I used to work in some of the titles before, they even used to track, in order to ensure that people weren't cheating, the levels to which your fingers would move in straight lines across the screen. And if it went over a specific percentage, like let's say 90% of the lines you made on the screen were all perfect straight lines, that you were probably a bot and were cheating in the game. Things like your IP address, the phone model, all of that, as well as in many games being logged. And so while some people might think something like, hehe, I have managed to slip past the region blocks with my VPN, oh hell not, or some silly stuff like that, especially in the games that do not force you to use a Japanese IP to play the game is sometimes able to just like feedback your IP address to them. So for one of the bigger titles I worked on in the past, like Powers and Dragons, for example, we could see the percentage of our player base in the Japanese version of the game that were coming from other countries. It's just that most games really just ignore that, because unlike Google, which has a vested interest in making you stay in your own region, most game companies really just don't give a fuck. They just want you to like play the game and spend the money. So they don't really want to clamp down on someone because of the region specifically. But basically all I'm trying to say with all this is that because of the fact that a game is tracking all of this data, it actually has a very good way to track the percentage of each bracket of its player that's leaving. And when I say demographic, I don't mean like specifically age demographic, because like some people like me, for example, we look so old that even if, and most companies don't do it to this level, but even if they had the Chinese spyware to use your camera to take a picture of your face, they can't really identify your age from that. So the thing is that age is not typically the demographic, nor is gender. What I mean when I say demographic is I'm talking about the level or spending patterns of an individual player, because most games actually do track a lot of that. It's like how actively a player spends every month in their lifetime and all of that. And basically it's just that they categorize them into different groups, and they would just monitor all of this individually to see how big a percentage of each group is leaving at any given time. And the reason why you're managing and observing all of the groups is because of the fact that it's not important to just analyze and appease the whales, but to appease the entirety of the player base for as much as possible, because it is a win-win for the company to ensure that the free players stay around as well. Because as the big saying on internet goes, if you are not spending money on the thing, you are kind of the product. And in the case of a game, especially for many of these mobile games, the way this actually factors in is that the people who stay around, even if they may not spend, they do tend to form a big proportion of the overall player base. And while they may not spend on the game, these are people who might spend on other things outside of the game that you might actually try to do. And on top of that, there are also people that a company can then use to show sponsors or to show collab partners that the game is doing well, to basically get the partners in to basically get even more money. You can think of it as if you wanted to get a collab of Marvel, for example, you will need to be able to show Disney that you're a company that is at least fairly big enough and that has a big enough player base that lending you the rights to the IP would actually give them enough of a sale to basically also give them enough of a kickback to basically earn more. So in the end, the DAU, MAU numbers, the overall size of the player base is also important, and that's why all of this is typically being tracked. And not only that, they also basically provide the size of the population of the game that is required to make the whales actually able to be at least some level of on top of the other players as well, because the people who are spending a huge amount within the game, while there are some that are doing it just for a love of the game, there are also those who do it because they want to be on top in the ranking for whatever reason that they have. And so you kind of want to ensure that all of these people are able to stay on top. And the only way to do that is to ensure that there are people who aren't whales who are also playing the game, to basically form the basis on top of which these people can stand at the top of the little pyramid. I don't know what I'm trying to do there. And so there are multiple different reasons why a company would want to actually track and ensure the sustainability of the entire player base overall. And when I talk about attrition, typically the way that one would actually look at this is basically just how much of each group is leaving every single month. So when I say that, what I mean is that most companies probably would have a fixed guideline, especially for games that have run for a long time, where they might have something like, for example, okay, so if a player doesn't log in after 14 or maybe 28, let's say, consecutive days, the player is considered to have dropped out. So, and on top of the monthly average that the companies might look at, they will also typically look at the amount for specific events as well, especially for things like collabs, because the whole point of running a collab for the company that is doing it in their game is oftentimes not so much to earn more money, but to actually get more people into the game. It's not so much about we put in Ram from ReZero into Nikke so that she can shake her ass and the people who play the game would actually spend money on it, or rather is to join all the people who already watch and or read and enjoy ReZero to try out some of these games and to hopefully stay, and therefore they can expand their player base while hopefully also getting sales on top of that. And so whenever they run specific events like this, many companies would also then check the attrition rate of the event itself. So on day one, how many people are coming in, and then after a set number of days, how many people are still retaining, and then they will basically use this to try and calculate how many of the new people entering the game are still actually consistently playing the game, and they can then get a good attrition rate of the individual collabs as well. And I know what you might be thinking, especially for those gacha games out there are people who just come in and re-roll multiple accounts over and over again, as they call it, the Isemara in Japanese. And in general, in many games, the people who do all of this re-rolling are basically causing DAU numbers to be inflated initially, because there are so many new users entering when maybe realistically only a third or maybe a fifth of them are actually people who are playing the game or planning to play it. Many companies actually already do take that into account. For example, some companies, the way they might do it is that they might track how much time a player spends in the game on day one. So if a player just comes in, plays through the tutorial, skips through the tutorial, reaches the gacha and then drops off, then they just do not log in again for maybe like a day or two. That might already be enough for them to basically just decide that this is probably just a reset account. And so you might see some similarities between how attrition rate and the active users might actually work, because of the fact that, well, if the active users are decreasing, then the attrition rate obviously is also likely to be going up. And that is kind of true, but not really, in the sense that the big difference here is how granular you're getting down to. Where with the attrition rate, you are looking at how individual demographics are decreasing, and so you're getting a more refined data than just the DAU and MAU. And the thing with DAU and MAU is that it may not be able to track this type of numbers as well, because if new people are constantly coming in as the current player base is leaving, the DAU might stay the same, but it might also make it a lot harder to then see specifically how the active player base is actually reducing over time. Because with the attrition rate, the big thing, especially when you're looking at it via the different demographics, is that you can see who is leaving from which groups at how big of a rate as compared to just DAU, which is basically just a large number, to look at the total number of active users that may potentially be staying the same. Because even if a company were to split the DAU by the demographics, the big difference is that, let's say in an extreme case, you have 50,000 whales, and out of the 50,000 whales, 10,000 are leaving every single month, but coincidentally 10,000 people from somewhere in your player base or in the new player base are constantly coming in and adding into this whale count, so you're seeing it stay constant. The fact of the matter is that there is actually a problem that exists there in terms of the fact that the people who are spending money are also the ones that are leaving in a fairly big amount, and these are things that a company can only realistically pick up if they're looking at the attrition rate as well, because from there they can then try to understand better what the issues are and improve the game as a result. Another fun fact is that the reason why the attrition is typically looked at as a rate and not as a raw number is because of the fact that it actually allows you to build a fairly good sample case out of the average attrition rate of people who are entering the game when there's like nothing really big going on. Basically, if a game is not running any massive new events that are intended to draw in people, even then there are typically still a small number of people coming in every other day if the game is big enough, who are just there to test out the game. And the reason why these people are actually fairly important to the data set as well is because of the fact that these are the people who typically are entering the game not because of the fact that their favorite anime waifu or Mr. Gojo from the Jujutsu Kaisen is in the game, but rather because of the fact that they genuinely want to try out the game. And so you get a good sample case on the average, if you look at the rate, of how the average person who is testing out the game with an interest in it is actually being retained. And so you can then use them as a fairly good sample case or control case to see that during a collab, how many or what percentage of the people are being retained. Because if the percentage, the rate is actually higher, that means that the people who come in from these collabs are actually people who are for some reason really interested in the game enough to stay more so than the average person coming in. So there might be something there, and for the company this allows them to test the efficacy of all of these collabs, and for them it might actually be a sign that perhaps actually using collabs is actually workable because the people are coming in, and because these characters that they're bringing in with them are things that they like, they're actually staying for longer, for example. Or if you see that it's really low and maybe it's a fifth or maybe a tenth or 100th of the control sample, it might show to the live service team that, okay, therefore you may not actually even want to run collabs in the first place because they aren't really doing anything for the specific types of goals you have if your goal is to draw new people in. And if the goal is to retain people through a collab, which I don't know if there's any game that actually retains people through collabs, to be honest. Maybe something like Powers and Dragons and Monster Strike, where like 70% of the game is a collab at this point, but the general assumption is that most games don't. But even then, if that is the goal, you can then look at the attrition rate of the specific groups like your core users, and is it actually reducing during the collabs? And from that, you can actually get a good idea of whether or not it works as well. Another effective one are the stage clear rates as well. And by this, I mean in terms of the rates of specific levels or stages in the game being cleared. This one typically is a little different in the sense that while it does tie in still, what you're looking at is more how much your players are actually progressing the content that you think you're putting in there to basically keep them entertained and playing for longer. So this comes in many forms. If you're having a collab, for example, you might be looking at the clear rates of the individual collab stages, and you can then split this by demographic to see how many of the new players coming in are actually clearing all of this. In specific very weird cases, you might also actually find this to be very useful in the case of something like Heaven Burns Red, where they actually changed up the damage formula and that messed up the game so badly that people couldn't actually clear the tutorial anymore. So yeah, it helps to also catch things like that, and also works as a good way to check if there's any unintended warping of the gameplay. And as I mentioned before, most of these games, they tend to track a lot, if not most of the data of what exists within the game as long as you're playing it. I know in the EU you can actually ask them to delete most of this data, but for the rest of us who don't live in those states, they just keep most of our data for life, so they kind of do have a very good idea of what people are using, like the teams, the deck builds, to basically clear individual stages. This allows them to basically check if the new content is even being attempted, if at the very least the people that they think are supposed to be able to clear the content are able to clear it. And it also factors back into the attrition that I was talking about before, because it allows them to use this data alongside the attrition to see if the new players, for example, are actually clearing the content as intended. Are people just turned off by the gameplay melee, in which case you would tend to see that the attrition rate is higher once the need to clear stages comes in, and then people typically stop at a certain point as a result of that. And if a character you release is unintendedly too strong and it's just breaking the meta, for example, you might be able to catch it from this, and this would then allow the devs to either fix it or to rebalance future content to ensure that there is a more healthy use of all the different characters, so that people do not feel too stressed that they have to use a specific character, which might fatigue people who don't have the character, or it might actually just cause people to become bored with the game because all they're doing is just repeating the same thing over and over instead of actually having to think about the different ways to play against different things. And so while it may seem to be a little unrelated to the health of a game, the rates at which a stage is clear and how the stages are being cleared is actually something that is actually being monitored by many of these games, and it's being used to actually understand the healthiness of the environment within the game itself, and therefore that can be used to ensure that things such as the DAU and sales can be maintained in the long term as well. Another important thing to look at is also the levels to which people are spending money, or the expenditure as compared to the actual depletion of resources. Basically what I mean is, are people immediately spending the things that they are actually purchasing, or are they stocking it for the future because they have been reinforced into doing that by specific play patterns that have emerged because of the way that things have been sold within the game till now? For a more extreme example of this, I used to know through a friend group one of the biggest whales in the EN version of Azure Lane back in the day. The guy spent so much money that apparently once he actually got the game's like actual transaction gateway like frozen or something because of the fact that the bank thought he was getting scammed by a Chinese company or something. Look, he used to spend a lot of money on the game, like a few thousand a month, and you might think, like, why is anyone even spending that much on Azure Lane? It's not even a game where you need to spend on the gacha to begin with. And you're right, he didn't, but he did it anyway, because he wanted to put in money to store for the future, even though there was no form of like discount or anything within the game. Yes, people can sometimes take actions that are like, I know the average person isn't gonna do this, but it is important to look at the data itself, because of the fact that it will actually give you an understanding of why a certain event may not have performed as well sales wise. Because for some games as well, if they are constantly selling packs, it could lead to people spending specifically during those periods. They get the thing, you earn the money, but as a result of that, they have stocked up and they're not spending it. And when the time comes, they actually spend it. And because of that, the sales numbers actually don't go up that much during those periods, specifically because everyone is buying the pack that came out maybe like a few months ago. And therefore, they're spending all of it now. And this is especially the case in games where there is a form of delayed release, for example, where for the Asians, but maybe the Korean, Chinese, or Japanese version is a few months ahead of the English version, for example. And in such a case, people may spend less because of the fact that they know that they want to buy this thing because this thing is really worth the value for money, because they have the preemptive knowledge that this thing is going to release, and so they buy it, and then they just wait all the way until they actually need to spend it in the future when the meta gets to a certain level and things are actually worth investing in, as compared to the player who doesn't have all of that prior information to make a decision. And then this can therefore warp the spending patterns of the players. And as a result, you know, it doesn't matter if someone's looking at the sales data as specifically a player or as the devs themselves. A specific banner doing worse in a specific region or specific release of the game may not actually as a result be a good indicator that people are not spending the game overall. They might be spending still, but their spending patterns might be different, and as a result, they actually might have preemptively prepared for these things instead, and that is what is leading to the poor sales. But that said, while it may be a specific metric or piece of data that might be more difficult to use because it requires pulling a bunch of different data together to then observe all of its entirety, this is one thing that is actually fairly important for a live service team to actually understand better how healthy the game is and how healthy the way that they have designed the economy of the game actually is. And lastly, and this one to me might be one of the more important ones, but that will be really, really difficult even for people within the company to potentially gauge, is the levels to which of game content is actually contributing to the overall sales of the game. And this is one of those things that, because of the fact that companies aren't gonna go around itemizing every single different way that a game is being marketed or sold and trying to then put all of that in their financial reports to show you like how exactly each download for each fragment within their game is actually doing, it can get very difficult at times to figure out how much of the game's sales, especially for a very big company like for like, let's say Nexon or something, how much of a specific game sales are coming from the merchandising or everything that's happening outside of the game itself. Because especially for big titles nowadays, it's not just about the game anymore, but it's about, you know, the lifestyle, kind of like what Nintendo likes to do with like its Nintendo Land and all of that. You set up big attractions, you set up a whole bunch of merch sales, online services, what have you not, and all of that combined now is actually also contributing to the sales. So while the games themselves might be helping to earn money for the company, there is a whole periphery that exists around that can also potentially bring in equal if not more money than the game itself. In the case of something like, let's say Uma Musume, for example, where the anime is a gateway to bring people into the game, the out of game content can also serve as a way to pull in the DAU, which would then contribute to the sales within the game as well. So there's a whole bunch of different ways that all of this can happen, and it's very difficult to quantify specifically how much each of these are actually relating to each other as well. And contrary to what some people might think, this actually isn't all that new. It's not something that only popped up in the past 5-6 years. This has been around for a long time. We have IPs like Love Live and Idolmaster that have been doing this with their mobile games for a very long time. Like, you already had like Idolmaster gacha games on the Gacha phones that they used to have back in the boomer days of Japan. But it is true that nowadays you're starting to see more and more of that, right? You have like League of Legends, which if you play the original game, may the Emperor save your soul, and how the IP has basically spread into multiple different things, right? You have a TV show, you have a fighting game, you have multiple online card games, you have a physical card game. All of these things are also part of the IP now. They are also serving in a way to keep the base games healthy. So like the healthiness of the game itself may also be a result of all of these things existing in the same ecosystem, and they are keeping people within a much bigger ecosystem that feeds back to the game itself as well. And in some case, the game itself may become less of a profit driver, but instead become the gateway for all of these other things as well, basically to create the wider lifestyle that exists within the ecosystem that basically keeps people spending. Because especially when it comes to gacha games, not everybody wants to spend on the gacha, and many people get fatigued by it as well. And instead, if I really like the game a lot, I would rather spend my money on things like merch, for example, like our tiny little gremlin over there. Because to me, spending on something physical like this, for example, is something that I feel happier to do, because of the fact that even if the game actually ends servers, it can actually stay as a very good memorial of the fact that the game used to exist. Kind of like with an anime, for example, that you watch, right? You really like the anime, but all animes eventually have to end. And the way some people might actually like to keep their memory around is by through goods as well. And so at some point, the game itself may become a lot less of a profit driver. And at that point, it becomes a lot harder to track the sales levels as well as the performance of a game. Because all you really get when you look at all these details and data online is estimations of in-game purchases and app spending. So if something like, especially with the Idol series, like Idolmaster, with your Sekai projects, your Love Lives and whatnot, they are also basically a part of a much bigger ecosystem that's also selling like multiple monthly new good pushes or stuff like that. And basically, it gets a lot harder to calculate the overall sales and how much the game itself is contributing to it, because the amount that people might be spending outside of the game may actually be more than how much they're spending in it. And the more they spend on these things outside, they might also then feel like they may not want to spend as much in the game itself, especially for something like Idolmaster, but if you're going to be spending tens of thousands on merch to prepare your Ita bag, you're going for live performances that also cost in the tens of thousands. It may result in you just deciding, okay, maybe I just don't want to spend like 30,000 yen or 100,000 yen on the game every single month, because I have all of these other things that exist as well. And the reason why I say it's hard to track is because all of this, especially as the company gets bigger and bigger, they might actually be handled by completely different divisions. You look at something like Gakuen Idolmaster, the school Idolmaster thing that's on mobile that's very popular now. The game itself is developed and partially run by Quali Arts, which is not even the company that owns the IP, Bandai Namco. And as a result, as a company that is also not as related to many of the goods and marketing pushes for the game as well. It gets very difficult with situations like this to try and figure out how much of the individual sales are coming from the other facets and faculties of the game that are actually keeping the overall IP profitable, and therefore allowing a company to actually continue to maintain the game. And in a way, it actually contributes to why a game itself may not look like it's doing as healthily, but overall the game is still doing fine and it's still actually getting a fair amount of support. This idea of a multimedia mix is something that's getting more and more popular, and as a result, the game itself is simply a single facet of a much bigger thing, within which the sales is then looked at in a more macro perspective. And the reason why all of this is important is because it's not only creating multiple different facets for people to enter the game from, and it's not only creating multiple different ways for people to spend on the game and therefore the IP overall in a way that is less fatiguing and therefore makes it more sustainable, but it also can actually contribute a lot to things like DAU retention as well, because the people who have all of these things, they basically feel more inclined to continue, because even though they might spend less time on it on a daily basis, it is still something that they might actually stay around for longer and are less likely to quit precisely because they have all of these things around them as well. And as a result, it is something that is very difficult to quantify, but I do feel that it is something very important that we can look at least to some extent when trying to judge a game. But that said, those are all the factors that I think are fairly important to look at when considering if a game is in a healthy state or not. Once again, as a reminder, I'm not saying to use one of these individually, but to use all of this in tandem wherever possible. I know it can be very difficult, but then again, to make a value judgment on whether or not something is doing well, it's always a difficult thing. It's why so many companies are constantly like suffering and making bad mistakes while trying to do so, because there is a lot that one would want to look at to make a proper decision, and there's a lot of things that one would need to take into account. They may not be as easy to access as one thinks. If you want to do it, I recommend you look into like some of the tools themselves as well. Like, they may not be as easy to get as an individual. At least for indie companies, some of these tools do have like indie level plans, and there are many different ways that you can try to also gather data or try to understand and interpret data. That will be very important if you want to actually do all of this kind of analysis at a more in-depth level. Though I feel like with many of the things I'm talking about, they'll only really be more as important or more important if you're working within these types of live service game companies as well, which if you do may Armatera still bless your soul, because like as someone who used to do it in the past, it's definitely not easy, that's for sure. But that's it. That's all I have for you guys today. Thank you all for watching, and I hope this was an interesting one. With these videos, a lot of them is just me rambling about things I learned in the past, as well as the thoughts I've had about them over the years as someone who still works in the game industry and other parts of it. And so like looking all of this and thinking about it and reflecting on it, a lot of those are things that either I came to the conclusion after or that I learned at the time. So either way, thank you to the very cool people here who constantly help to support the channel. It's thanks to you all and the support that you guys give and that all of you give watching the videos that I'm able to continue doing all of this. But that said, I'll be heading off for now. So until next time, take care, and I do hope I can put everything back soon enough. But until then, bye-bye!